You're kneeling on a cold concrete floor, and there's a wooden box in front of you that nobody has opened in about 70 years. The hinges scream when you lift the lid. Inside, packed tight with old straw and felt, sits a heavy metal pot with a lid clamped down hard. And you have no idea that this ugly little box is the reason a family of 9 ate hot suppers all winter on almost no fuel. That box is real. I found it. And what it taught me changed how I think about every dollar leaving my house right now. Here's the claim I'm going to prove to you before this is over. Earlier, Canadians cooked full meals, hot stews, beans, whole roasts, using less than a fifth of the energy we burn today. Not because they had better stoves, because they knew a trick we were quietly allowed to forget. I traced it all the way back to a government bulletin printed in 1918, buried in an agricultural archive, and to an old woman in eastern Ontario who still uses the method every single week. And I promise you this works whether you own your home, rent an apartment, or heat with a stove that's older than you are. Let me take you back to the moment I found that box, because I almost walked right past it. It was late October, and I was helping a neighbor clear out his late father's farmhouse near Perth, Ontario. Cold rain, the kind that gets into your knuckles. We'd been at it for hours, hauling out rusted tools and mouse-chewed furniture, when I moved a stack of feed sacks in the corner of the summer kitchen and saw the box wedged behind them. I thought it was a toolbox. It was heavier than a toolbox should be. And when I dragged it into the light, I could see the wood was lined on the inside with thick gray felt packed around a nest of old hay, and cradled in that nest was a cast pot with a locking lid. My neighbor glanced over and said something I couldn't shake for weeks. He said, "Oh, that's the old cooker. Dad said his mother could feed the whole crew off one stick of wood." Then he went back to hauling out chairs like he'd said nothing at all. 1 stick of wood. 9 people. I stood there in that cold kitchen holding a box I didn't understand, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt like I'd been lied to my whole life about how much cooking is supposed to cost. Because here's what was happening in my own house that same month. My hydro bill had climbed again. My gas bill had climbed again. My wife and I were doing everything the smart people tell you to do, and the number at the bottom kept going up. And now I'm holding proof that a farm woman in the 1920s fed a small army for a fraction of what it costs me to boil a pot of soup. I had to know how. So I took the box home. I set it on my workbench, and I started pulling the thread. The first thing I did was study the box itself, because the box is the whole secret, and it's so simple it made me angry. There was no heating element, no wires, no fuel of any kind inside it. It was just a thick wooden crate, insulated with felt and straw on every side, with a snug well in the middle sized exactly to hold that heavy pot. The lid closed down tight and latched, and that's when the shape of the mystery came clear. This box didn't cook food. It couldn't. There was nothing to make heat. So what on earth was it for? I turned it over. On the underside of the lid, faint but readable, someone had written in pencil, "Bring to a hard boil, 20 minutes, then in. Bring to a boil, then in." In where? Into the box. That one pencil line was my first real clue, and it took me down a rabbit hole I did not climb out of for a month. Because what that woman was doing, I'd learn, has a name. It's called retained heat cooking. You heat your food to a hard boil on the stove for a short time, just long enough to get everything screaming hot. Then you take the whole pot off the heat, still sealed, and you nest it into that thick insulation. And the box holds the heat in so completely that the food keeps cooking for hours on its own. No more fuel. Not a stick, not a match, not a watt. The pot goes in at a rolling boil, well above 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and because almost no heat can escape through all that felt and straw, it stays up in the safe cooking range above 160 degrees for 4, 5, even 6 hours. Long enough to turn dried beans soft. Long enough to break down a tough, cheap cut of meat into something that falls apart on your fork. So the woman who owned my box wasn't cooking with fire for an hour. She was cooking with fire for 20 minutes, and letting the box do the other 4 hours for free. I did the arithmetic on my own kitchen, and I actually had to sit down. A pot of dried beans on my stove takes about 2 hours of steady simmering. 2 hours of gas, or 2 hours of a glowing electric element. With this method, I'd need maybe 20 minutes of real heat, and the rest is nothing. That's not a small saving. That's cutting the fuel for that meal by around 80%. 80%. On every slow-cooked meal, all winter. But here's what kept me up at night. If this thing works this well, and it's this simple, and it needs no special equipment, then why in the world had I never heard of it? Why did my neighbor say it like it was nothing? Why was it rotting behind a stack of feed sacks instead of sitting on every kitchen counter in this country? That question is what turned a curiosity into an investigation. Because something this good doesn't just vanish by accident. So I went looking for where it came from, and the trail was older and bigger than I ever expected. The next morning I started calling around. I've got a habit of talking to the oldest people in any small town, because they remember things that never made it into books. And an old fellow at the Perth Museum pointed me to a woman named, I'll just call her Eileen, in her late 80s, living out past Smith's Falls, who he said still cooks in a haybox. Haybox. That was a new word to me. I drove out to see her. Eileen made me tea, and then she showed me hers. It wasn't a fancy wooden crate like mine. Hers was a galvanized wash tub she'd packed with old wool blankets and a hay-stuffed cushion on top. In the middle sat a pot of split pea soup she'd boiled that morning before church. She lifted the lid at 2 in the afternoon and steam rolled out, and it was still piping hot, still gently cooking, and she hadn't touched the stove in 5 hours. She told me her mother called it the Fireless cooker, and she said something that stuck with me. She said, "We didn't do it to be clever. We did it because wood was work and money was thin. You cut the wood, you split the wood, you carried the wood. Every hour of fire you saved was an hour of your own back you saved. Every hour of fire was an hour of your back." That's the mindset we lost. We stopped seeing the true cost of the energy we burn because it comes through a wire and a pipe now, and the bill only shows up once a month, long after we've forgotten what we did to earn it. If this way of thinking about energy, about mastery, about not handing over money for something you could do yourself, if that speaks to you the way it spoke to me, I want to point you to something I put together called Canadian Edge. It's a digital book that goes deeper into exactly this territory, the forgotten methods, the buried knowledge, the practical skills that earlier Canadians used to keep a household running on almost nothing. Everything in it is drawn from the same kind of archival digging and first-hand conversations that led me to that box in the first place. You'll find it linked in the description below, and I think if you're the kind of person watching this video all the way through, it was made for you. But the Fireless cooker was the one that hooked me, because it was the one sitting on my workbench, proving it still worked. So let me show you exactly how the science holds up, because I did not take any of this on faith. I tested it myself. Eileen told me the Fireless cooker was everywhere when she was a girl. Farm kitchens, town kitchens, lumber camps, and then, sometime after the war, it just quietly disappeared. New stoves came in, electricity spread, and a generation was gently taught that the modern way was the only way, and the old way was something to be a little ashamed of. Then she handed me the second big clue. She said her mother learned it not from her own mother, but from a government pamphlet during the First World War. A pamphlet that told ordinary Canadian women it was practically their patriotic duty to build one of these boxes. A government pamphlet telling people to burn less fuel. That did not sound like any government I knew. So I went to find that document, and when I found it, the whole story cracked wide open. Now, before I tell you what was in that bulletin, I need you to understand something, because this is where my nice little curiosity turned into something that genuinely made me angry. It took me weeks of digging through archives to track down the paper Eileen was talking about, but I found it. During the First World War, the Canada Food Board and the agricultural colleges of this country ran a serious official campaign teaching families how to build and use the Fireless cooker. There were bulletins. There were demonstrations. Home economics departments at places like Macdonald College and the Ontario Agricultural College were teaching it as sound science, because that's exactly what it is. The whole country was told, in plain language, that you could cook a full meal on a fraction of the fuel, that it was good for the household budget, good for the nation, and that any woman with a wooden box and some hay could do it. So this knowledge wasn't hidden back then, it was promoted by the government, in print, coast to coast, which makes the real question so much sharper. If it was that mainstream, that official, that proven, then who benefited when we forgot it? Because somebody did. Follow the money. Every meal you slow cook the modern way sells somebody a couple of hours of electricity or gas. Multiply that by 3 meals a day, by every household, by every winter, by decades. The Fireless cooker asked you to buy fuel once, at the start of the cook, and then it gave you the rest for free. Free doesn't sell. Free doesn't show up on a monthly bill. Free is the one thing an energy company can never invoice you for. Nobody had to hold a meeting and ban the Fireless cooker. They just had to sell us shiny new appliances, tell us the old ways were quaint, and let one generation forget to teach the next. And it worked. It worked so well that when I held that box in a cold farmhouse, a grown man who grew up in that house called it the old cooker and went back to hauling out chairs. That's how you bury knowledge in this country. Not with a lock, with forgetting. And the more I read, the worse it got, because the Fireless cooker wasn't the only thing on the chopping block. The same bulletins talked about a whole toolbox of methods for getting through a hard winter cheap, and one by one, almost all of them got quietly replaced with something you have to keep paying for. But the Fireless cooker was the one that hooked me, because it was the one sitting on my workbench, proving it still worked. Now, if you're sitting there thinking this is all fine for people with a farmhouse and a wood stove and a barn full of hay, I want to stop you right there, because this next part is the part I built specifically for you, for the person in the apartment, for the person renting a place with a landlord who won't let you change a light bulb, for the person in a small house who thinks none of this old-timer stuff applies to a modern kitchen. It does. And I'm going to prove it with things you already own. Here's what I did the very first weekend, with no special equipment at all. I took a regular pot with a tight lid, the kind you already have. I took a large cardboard box and a cooler, but a cooler isn't even necessary. And I gathered up old towels, wool blankets, and a couple of throw cushions. That's it. That's the whole shopping list, and it cost me nothing because it was already in my closet. I filled my pot with dried white beans and water, a bit of onion, some salt. I brought the whole thing to a hard, rolling boil on the stove and let it boil hard for about 15 minutes. Then I clamped the lid down tight, and I moved fast, because the enemy here is heat escaping. I set the hot pot into a nest of blankets inside the box, tucked towels down every side so there were no gaps, packed a folded blanket on top, and closed it all up. Then I walked away. I went and did my chores. 4 hours later I came back, a little afraid to look, honestly. I opened it up. Steam. Real steam. And those beans, which normally need 2 hours of babysitting on the stove, were soft, creamy, cooked right through. I had turned the stove on for 15 minutes and gotten a full pot of cooked beans out of it. I stuck a thermometer in. After 4 hours in a nest of ordinary household blankets, that pot was still sitting at about 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Still cooking. Still safe, still working, hours after I'd shut the heat off. That's when I truly believed it. Not from the archive, from my own kitchen counter, with a cardboard box and my wife's spare blankets. So let me give you the plain instructions, because you can do this exact thing this week in any kitchen in the country. You want foods that normally cook low and slow, dried beans and lentils, soups and stews, oatmeal and porridge, rice and other grains, tough, cheap cuts of meat that get better the longer they go. These are the foods that this method was born for, and they happen to be the cheapest foods in the store, which is the whole point. Start with a pot that has a good tight lid, and fill it fairly full, because a fuller pot holds its heat longer than a half-empty one. Bring it to a genuine hard boil on the stove, and keep it there for the short starting time. For soups and grains, 10 to 15 minutes. For beans, about 20. For a roast or a big stew, maybe 30 minutes to get the whole mass truly hot to the core. Then the golden rule. Do not lift that lid. Every time you peek, you dump heat, and heat is the fuel you already paid for. Move the sealed pot straight into your insulation as fast as you can. Pack it tight on all 6 sides so there's no air gap, and leave it completely alone for the hours it needs. Most meals are done in 4 to 6 hours. You can even set it before you leave in the morning and come home to supper cooked itself. For the insulation, anything thick and dry works. Wool blankets are best because wool holds heat beautifully. Towels, old pillows, foam cushions, even crumpled newspaper packed tight all around. A picnic cooler makes a fine, ready-made insulated shell, and a cardboard box lined with blankets works nearly as well. There is nothing to buy. There is nothing to install. There is nothing your landlord can say a single word about, because you're just cooking soup with a pot and some towels. And here's the part that matters for the wallet. If you cook slow meals even 3 times a week this way, you're cutting the energy for each of those meals by roughly 3/4 or more. That's not a gimmick. That's the same math the Canada Food Board put in front of Canadian families more than 100 years ago, and it hasn't changed because physics doesn't get a memo from the power company. But knowing how to save the fuel on the cooking led me straight to the biggest question of the whole investigation. Because Eileen said one more thing before I left her kitchen that day, and it's the thing that finally unlocked everything. She said, "The box wasn't the clever part. Any fool can wrap a pot in a blanket. The clever part was the thing my mother put in with it, the thing from the pamphlet. That's what made it safe to leave all day." And I didn't understand what she meant. Not for weeks. Until I finally got my hands on the actual wartime bulletin and read it line by line, and found the one detail that nobody talks about, the detail that turns a nice trick into a method you can actually trust to feed your family. That's the piece I want to leave you with, and it's the reason I made this whole thing. Here it is. Everything I traced, from that screaming wooden box in a cold farmhouse, through Eileen's washtub, all the way back to the archive, led to this. When I finally found the Fireless cooker instructions from that First World War-era Canadian campaign, printed and distributed to teach ordinary families, I expected the pot and insulation trick I already knew, and it was there. But there was more. There was the piece Eileen's mother swore by. The secret was a second stone. The old instructions told you to keep a separate flat stone, or a piece of soapstone, or a cast iron plate, and to heat that stone in the oven or right on the stovetop until it was blazing hot while your pot was coming to a boil. Then, when you nested your pot into the box, you set that screaming hot stone right on top of the sealed lid, under the blanket, before you packed everything down, and that changes everything. Because a pot alone only ever loses heat from the moment you seal it. It starts hot and slowly cools. But add a stone hotter than the food itself, sitting right against the lid, radiating down, and now you've got a second source of heat, pushing back against the cooling for hours. The old bulletin said this let you cook things a simple hay box never could. Bread. A proper roast. Anything that needed real sustained heat instead of a gentle fade. That hot stone was the difference between soup that stays warm and a full oven-style meal cooked with no oven. It's why Eileen's mother could do a roast in a washtub. It's why a farm woman could feed 9 people off, as my neighbor put it, 1 stick of wood. The stick heated the pot and the stone. The box and the stone did the rest, all day, for free. And the beauty of it is, you already have everything you need. A clean, flat rock from the garden, baked in your oven while your pot boils. A piece of soapstone if you can find one at a hardware store for a few dollars. Even a cast iron pan heated up and set on top, wrapped so it can't touch anything it shouldn't. Heat it hot, set it on the sealed lid, pack the blankets over the whole thing, and walk away. Think about what that means. With a pot, a box of blankets, and a hot stone, you can cook a full, hot, slow meal, a roast, a stew, a pot of beans, a loaf, using your stove for 20 or 30 minutes instead of 3 or 4 hours. That's a method proven by science, taught by your own government 100 years ago, kept alive by a handful of old women who never saw a reason to stop, and then quietly allowed to disappear because free doesn't sell. I tried it with the stone the next weekend. I heated a flat piece of granite in my oven while a beef stew came to a boil. Cheap stewing beef, the toughest cut in the case. Sealed the pot, set the hot stone on the lid, buried it in blankets. 6 hours later that beef was falling apart. The gravy was rich, and my stove had been off since mid-morning. I stood in my kitchen, eating a bowl of it, and I thought about that cold farmhouse, and the box behind the feed sacks, and how close all of this came to being lost for good. That's the whole trail. That's what the wooden box was trying to tell me. And now, it's yours. So here's where I've landed after all of it. We were made to feel that the old ways were poverty, something to escape, something to be a little embarrassed by. But the old ways weren't poverty. They were mastery. Those people understood the true cost of every bit of heat and every dollar, and they had answers we traded away for the convenience of a monthly bill we're not supposed to look at too closely. If you've ever felt in your gut that things shouldn't be this expensive, that somewhere along the way we were talked out of knowing how to take care of ourselves, then you already understand what this box taught me. You're the kind of person who suspects that a lot of what we call progress was really just someone finding a new way to put a meter between you and something that used to be free. And you're not wrong. Now I want to hear from you. That hot stone on the lid, the second heat trick from the wartime bulletin, had you ever heard of it? Or did your family have their own version? Maybe a hot brick wrapped in flannel, maybe something else entirely? Tell me. Type it in the comments right now, even just a line, because the whole reason methods like this survived at all is that one person told another, and I read every single one. And if you'd rather not lose the next piece of this, then keep it, subscribe, and stand with the rest of us who are digging this knowledge back up out of the ground where it was left to rot. Because I've already got my hands on the next one. It's about how those same families kept a cellar full of food from freezing solid all winter without a furnace anywhere near it, using nothing but the earth and one thing they buried in the corner. I found the record, and I can't wait to show you what it said. Right where this video stopped, I'll show you the complete retained heat cooker build and the cooking method, step by step, all waiting inside the Northern Ways circle. And you can ask me your own question, with a real person answering, myself or my team, never a machine. You'll belong among practical folks like you. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime with one click.